Hello everyone, and welcome to the Darkest Hour. I'm your host, Amanda Jane. Sometimes we may think we know someone, only to find out that we don't know them at all. It can be an especially jarring experience if this someone is someone that you trusted or had any sort of meaningful relationship with, but it can still impact you if it's just someone you knew in passing. Being duped by a stranger, family member, friend, it hurts in ways likely beyond comprehension, permanently or temporarily affected in ways people may never understand. In one moment, worlds flipped upside down. The same goes for situations, ones we perceive as safe or low risk. Maybe places we've been 1,000 times. We don't expect to be surprised, yet sometimes we are. Has it ever happened to you? Because it certainly happened to some. So, let's get started, shall we? Last fall, I went on a nighttime hayride. Not a spooky one. Well, it wasn't supposed to be spooky. It was supposed to be a scenic ride through a moonlit forest trail. I didn't even want to do it, but my best friend had got dumped the night before she planned to go. Tegan loves all the outdoorsy stuff. The stench of horses is basically her perfume. The ride started at 9, and the trail was a big loop that normally takes an hour to complete. But we were there through the following morning. All together with the driver and a young couple, we were a group of 5. Everything was completely normal for the first leg of the trip, but a few minutes before we arrived at the halfway marker, the guy across from me noted that the forest sounds had suddenly gone silent. There were no birds, no bugs, no rustling trees, nothing beyond the horses clomping in the squeaky wagon. I probably wouldn't have noticed it on my own, but once you do notice, there's no ignoring it. It takes a vast, heavy silence to cover an area that large. No one spoke again until we actually arrived at the halfway point. We were only stopping for a few minutes. There was a little bench for anyone who wanted to take pictures or just look around, and a bathroom. But as we started to climb back into the wagon, that strange, eerie silence was broken by a high-pitched scream. Both of the horses suddenly went crazy. The driver was just as shocked by their behavior as everyone else. He assured us that the scream had only been a bobcat, something that the horses heard on a regular basis. After several minutes of trying to calm the horses, they finally began to settle down, but the driver didn't want to risk an accident. Instead, he called his son to come get us in a pickup, and after giving us the update, he stepped away to make a second call. It was during that time that the rest of us heard a muffled cry from deeper in the forest. It was different from the bobcat scream. This was more akin to someone shouting for help with their mouth gagged. The 4 of us stared into the dark forest without moving for what felt like several minutes, until Tegan called out, "Hello? Is anyone there? Do you need help? Hello? Anyone there? Help!" The reply was instant, and though garbled, it was clearly a woman's voice. She sounded desperate, as if she'd been struggling against someone or something. I was getting ready to call 911 when the guy who sat across from me suddenly darted into the woods. His girlfriend called after him, but he didn't even spare a glance back. We heard him call out to the woman just once more, and then we never heard from either of them again. The driver noticed the commotion at the same time that his son was pulling up, and I'll never forget the look of sheer terror on his face as we explained the situation. We wanted to search the woods ourselves, but he wouldn't hear of it. He just said that it was too dangerous to go into that part of the forest after dark. Even search and rescue wouldn't come out until the next morning. But they never found any sign of that poor guy. I just don't understand so many things that happened that night. I don't understand how someone is right in front of you one minute and seemingly gone from the face of the earth in the next. There used to be a homeless man I'd always see on my way into work. I'm on the road near 5 a.m., and right off exiting the freeway, he'd be walking down the first crosswalk I'd get to. After the first few times of having to wait for this old man in his shopping cart to cross the road, he became a familiar staple in my mornings. He started to notice me too. I'm usually one of the only cars on the road that early. He'd start to wave, and I'd wave back. These encounters weren't intentional, and he never asked for money. I wouldn't see him literally every day, probably 3 or 4 days a week. Some days he'd be way past the crosswalk, and I'd give him a tiny honk so we could share our otherwise silent greeting. One morning, I was getting off the freeway, rolling through the crosswalk and heading towards work, and I noticed at the gas station a few hundred yards away, my guy, he's getting walloped by 2 other men. I quickly make a U-turn and start honking my horn as I pull into the station parking lot, hoping to scare off his attackers. It works. When I park, they run. I jump out and I help my guy off the ground. And by the time he's to his feet, the cops arrive and grab him out of my hands, slamming him back on the ground and pulling out their handcuffs. The worker at the gas station comes out front explaining to the officers that the man they've got was the one who tried to stop the robbery. They tell her to go back inside, then ask how I'm associated with the man before directing me to return to my car. As I slowly back away towards my car, the homeless man starts screaming and fighting the cops when they put the handcuffs on him. He starts banging his head on the concrete. The thud of the strikes are so loud, it's nauseating to watch such little regard he had for his safety. 2 of the cops are wrestling with him, while another stands by his shopping cart. I'm still standing outside my car door, frozen, watching the scene unfolding in front of me. The officer by the shopping cart turns and scopes out the big blue tarp being utilized as an umbrella shell, wrapping the cart like a small parachute-looking lid. Seeing that it's going to be more work than it's worth to untie and unwrap this tarp from the shopping cart, the officer takes out a small tactical knife from his belt, cuts the bungee cord keeping the tarp down. The cord snaps with the release of pressure, and the tarp is ripped to the ground. It reveals a decomposing body. This is a sight I'll never be able to unsee. I wish I would have listened to the cops and just drove away. They obviously knew who they had when they saw him. It gives me the willies to think that there was a dead body in that cart every time he'd pass my car. Every hood is haunted. I think it's actually an atrocity that I don't hear more stories about people claiming their haunted projects. I'll get to the real story, but understand I had experienced weird shit in the hood for as long as I could remember. In the streets, especially in areas near the school, you'd see these wispy things. I say things, but man, these were people. Ghosts. You can just see that shit on a Saturday night for free. They didn't mean harm or anything, they just seemed to exist. Some people were too scared to hang around long, but enough of us had seen them to know the place was haunted. I really thought everywhere was haunted. I still kinda do. But this story, it's not about those wispy things. It's about something I couldn't quite wrap my head around. Still can't. Our apartment complex in Baltimore had a little concrete, overgrown quarter court with a beat-up wooden backboard and metal chain hoop. I was an only child and my mom worked a lot, so I'd spend most of my afternoons into evenings out there shooting on the makeshift court. I'd be out there until it would be too dark to see the hoop and the ball's ricochet became dangerously hard to track. I'd be 11 after celebrating my birthday a day prior. My mom purchased me a glow-in-the-dark basketball. Real ballers know about night-bright balls. If you're not a real baller, they were basketballs that you'd have to leave up near a light source for a long time, and then when you turn the light off, the basketball slightly glows for a while, enabling you to kind of play basketball in the dark outside. The hoop is still pitch black, but you can see where the ball went. I'd left mine under a large desk lamp all that day, and I waited for the sun to set before I walked down to the court. The dim, soft glow of my basketball kept me hyped even though I realized my childlike expectation would exceed the actual illumination limitations of the ball. When I got to the court, the sun was still setting, and by the time it was fully dark, the ball had started to lose its vibrancy. So I started to take my last few buzzer-beater scenario jumpers before calling it good for the night. I'm back in the grass for a deep three. After I release the ball, I watch the soft light sail through the black. All I can clearly make out is the ball, and as I watch its arch sink, I hear the chained hoop swoosh and rattle. Right after it goes through the metal net, it stops in mid-air, like someone had silently caught it standing under the hoop. The ball is frozen above the ground. It's almost like my eyes couldn't process what I was seeing. I didn't know whether to be scared or gracious that someone had caught my ball before it bounced away. From where I'm standing, I lift up my arms and I shout, "Hey, can you toss that back?" I stayed where I was because I half thought that I might be getting robbed, because that ball didn't move. At age 11, I'd already been threatened with a knife by an adult and engaged in my fair share of fights. I've won some fights, I've gotten my ass beat as well, but I've never ran. Even at that age, I was headstrong. So when I perceived this as someone messing with me, I took a step towards the floating, glowing basketball. I still couldn't make out who this person was holding the ball, so I took another step and said hello again. My eyes are fixed on the ball as it suddenly falls from the air, bouncing to the ground with its original intended impact, like unpausing a movie. The sharp sound of its rubber bounce echoes off the apartment walls, and the sudden noise makes me literally jump out of my skin. As the echoes ceased, the court became quiet. Too quiet for my liking, so I decided to dip home, almost forgetting my ball. As soon as I turn around to grab the thing, it's actively rolling towards me, still quiet as fuck. I hesitated to grab the thing. It's one thing to face someone twice your size, but it's a whole new deal facing something with no face at all. Fuck it. I left the ball. I didn't run home, just made it there at a leisure pace. But damn, I wanted to run. I remember lying to my mom. I don't know why, but I figured she wouldn't believe my story, and if she did, the only part she'd care about is the fact that I'd left the ball there. Let's just say that she's not afraid of no ghosts, but that's her, not me. As far as she's concerned, it was just another day in the hood when someone bigger than me took something they wanted. Kinda screwed myself out of nightballing, though. In Baltimore, I had a 1 in 12 chance of becoming one of these spectral homeboys that you see on the Ring doorbell videos nowadays. I'm not going to get on here and act hard. My mom moved us out of Scranton when I was 12. My grandpa died of cancer. My mom was his only child. They had an estranged relationship, but he had no one else in his life, no living relative. And the only person that was even listed on any legal documents was his daughter, my mom. So she took everything he left her and moved us out to Scranton. And that's where I learned that the wispy people I'd seen in Baltimore, they weren't everywhere. My therapist gave me a list of suggestions for how to cope with my recent trauma. The least painful recommendations included sharing my stories with a support group and journaling. So it seemed like Reddit was a good place to kill two birds with one stone. A few weeks ago, I almost died. It wasn't an accident or a random attack. It was a planned attack to end my life. For context, I'm a 27-year-old female who lives alone in a quiet suburban neighborhood. And my parents were killed by drunk drivers last year. Neither of them had siblings, and all of my grandparents have already passed away, so my brother is the only family that I have left in the world. I'm also an asexual lesbian, which means normal relationships are pretty much off the table. It probably sounds easier to find a female partner with no interest in sex than it would be to find a male, but it's really not. I won't dive into all the heartache this issue has caused me over the years. I'll just say that sometimes the loneliness is unbearable. Being an introvert who wants nothing to do with society isn't the same thing as wanting to spend your life completely alone. It's just hard to find someone who shares the same sentiments. In fact, dating apps with brutally honest profiles are just about the only hope, and that's how all of this started. You're probably thinking I met a crazy chick who tried to kill me. It's far more complicated than that. I decided to try Bumble because it has a feature that requires the women to initiate contact, which eliminates a lot of creepy interactions. Within the first few days of using it, I started talking to a woman named Beth. She was 2 years younger than myself, introverted, and asexual. In other words, she already seemed too good to be true. I have trust issues in general, but the more we talked, the more it seemed like we were destined to find each other. Sometimes it felt like we had everything in common. If she hadn't said most of her interests first, I wouldn't have believed her. Over the next 4 weeks, we talked more and more, until the hours spent working and sleeping were the only times we weren't in contact. I wanted to graduate to FaceTime or at least phone calls, but Beth always shot the idea down. She had a list of insecure complexes. And since I have a hefty list of my own insecurities, I chose not to pressure her. The only thing I really cared about at that point was meeting her in person. We lived an hour apart. Neither of us wanted to add the stress of being in public on top of the stress that comes with a first date. Unfortunately, women are just as vulnerable to gender bias as men. Simply because I believed she was a woman, I felt completely safe agreeing to make a drive to her home. I worried that she might not look exactly like her picture, but I never even considered her entire profile might be a catfish. Her address took me through the city and out the other side to a rural area with several acres of land between each house. The GPS led me straight down a long driveway to an older home hidden away by tall trees and bushes. Once parked, I texted Beth to let her know I was there, and she immediately replied, "I ran to the store for a bottle of wine, but the door's unlocked. Make yourself at home. I'll be right back." I didn't like that. There's always that twinge of paranoia when you're at the wrong place when visiting a new home for the first time. I thought about staying outside, but I'll admit, curiosity got the better of me. I opened the door and began to stick my head inside when I was blasted with the musty, rotten smell of a moldy house, one that had been vacant for years. It reeked of urine, like the former owners kept several pets, but there was also the smell of something rotten, like something had crawled into the walls and died. My first thought was that I came to the wrong house after all, that Beth must have typed the wrong numbers or backwards or something. As I reached to pull out my phone, I caught a glimpse of movement through the crack in the door. The side with the hinges. It was truly a miracle I managed not to scream, but I could just make out someone's eye staring at me through the crack. They were hiding behind the door, waiting to grab me when I stepped inside, and I'd been so close to doing just that. The person didn't make any moves to indicate that they were aware of being spotted. so I proceeded to take out my phone as if checking the time. I needed to get out of there. But I was afraid of being chased if they thought that I was leaving. Instead, I went to the door once more, but stopped at the last second saying, "Shoot, I forgot my drink." Then, as casually as possible, I walked back to my car, locked myself inside, and punched the gas. I had to turn around before I could go, and as I put the car into drive, I saw a man charging at me with a baseball bat. He was only a few feet away. When I finally got pointed in the right direction, he had time to shatter one of my taillights as I sped away. But I call that an extremely small price to pay, considering what could have happened out there. I drove straight to the police station and told them everything. I showed them all of my messages from Beth, along with the busted taillight, and they opened an investigation. The whole time I assumed the man who tried to kill me was just some deranged serial killer that I was unfortunate enough to cross paths with. But that wasn't the case. Police arrested the man who attacked me a few days later. He was hiding in the same area, just a different empty house, probably one with a better smell. When they ran his prints and DNA, there were several matches for unsolved murder cases all over the country. They had enough on him to warrant seeking the death penalty, so he was eager to make a deal. As it turns out, he was a hitman. My brother created Beth's profile, cultivated a relationship with me, and hired a hitman so he could have my half of the inheritance. According to him, it's all wasted with me because I'll never do anything with my life. And maybe he's not wrong, but that doesn't give him the right to kill me. A couple of years ago, I used to coach my son's youth basketball team. Me and another dad had been running practice at this little recreation center that the city let us borrow on weeknights. I actually played basketball through the same youth program when I was a kid. That was in the 90s, and back then, all the teams would rotate between the 4 community gyms weekly. Nowadays, we're designated one gym to switch off days with a second team. And of course, we're selected to practice at the oldest, ricketiest one in town. It had been old and broken since I was a kid, and was the only one not to have been remodeled. There's paint chipping on the walls, and pigeons live in the ceiling rafters. We used to think the place was haunted. There's a big stage at the far end of the court for when performances are held. On the stage are big, dusty red curtains that were drawn so basketballs wouldn't bounce on the stage, knocking over theater props. When I was a kid myself, I remember us taking a water break, and curiously I walked on the stage and poked my head behind the curtains. There was a single standing lamp turned on near the back that partially illuminated a door. In the gap between the door and the floor, I could see a sliver of light and people walking around inside. Then, the door slid open and a woman walks out, then turns left and walks into the dark. On the other side of the door is an office. There's a few other people walking around in there, dressed in business attire I'd only seen in black and white movies. A man moves in front of the door and shuts it, returning the backstage area to full black. When I got off the stage, it was so impressive when my friends wanted to go see. I said, "Don't bother, it's just an office." Some 20-odd years later, now a coach, I'm picking up the keys from a maintenance worker early in the morning. He walks me around the building, inside and outside, showing me all the emergency turn-off valves, locks, and codes for the building. Near the end of the tour, he walks me up the stage and through the curtains. When we enter, it's the same black I'd poked my head into years ago. He walks to the wall, flips on the lights. They slowly blink to light with an electrical buzz of life. The man walks me over to the back office door. He shows me the key to its lock and then tests out the handle. A turn and a click unlocks the door. It opens to the back parking lot. I ask the maintenance guy if he knows any history on this place, if there used to be offices behind the stage. He said there haven't been any additions or alterations to the building since it was constructed in the 1960s. It's a historically preserved landmark. The next night is our first practice. It gets out at 7:30 and it's dark by the time the parents are picking up the kids and everyone's leaving. My assistant coach has already left. My kid is sitting in the car playing on his Switch while I finish locking up. The front lights have already been turned off, and I just turn off the main set of hanging lights on the opposite side of the gym. Then I turn to walk in the dark to the front doors. Halfway to the exit, I hear the sound of a muffled dog's bark. The noise echoes through the empty gym and startles me off my feet. I'd just been through the whole building. There's no way a dog could have gotten in. I decided to continue out the doors instead of looking around. When I get to the car, I ask my son if he hears any dogs barking. He says no, but then directs my attention to just beyond our headlights. I stay in park, and I look at where his fingers are pointing over the dash. He said there's a boy hiding behind the trees. He keeps popping his head out and looking at me. I asked if it's someone from the team, and he says no. I wait and I stare in the direction he's pointing, but I don't see the person that he's talking about. A week later, after practice, I'm making my rounds in the building to lock up. While I'm juggling the keys looking for the correct ones for the side doors, I physically feel something brush past me and run into the bathrooms. The hinges of its weighted door slide open and back closed. The sensation is so real that I think my son had run in to go pee before we hit the road. When I turn around and open the door again, the bathroom lights are still off. Convinced it's my son in there, I flick on the bathroom lights and call out his name. When he doesn't respond, I take a couple of steps in so I can see around the tile barrier. I repeat my son's name. Still no response. Then I squat down to look under the stalls. I'm horrified when I see 2 bare feet standing in the stall furthest from me. They're children's feet, but they're not my son's. One at a time, I watch each foot slide up and out of view, like they were attempting to hide. The hair was starting to stand up on my arms, and I just wanted to get out of there. But I worked up my courage and walked over to the stall where I saw the feet, and I knocked. The door swings open from my tap, and it's empty inside. The bathroom suddenly felt like the temperature had dropped. Within seconds, my breath was visible in front of me. When I turned out the lights and left the bathroom, the rest of the gym had stayed the same temperature. I could immediately feel the difference the moment I left the bathroom. The youth program has an all-coaches meeting every other week. The other coaches that were seated at the table with me all know each other, so I'm excluded from most of their conversations until the table was asked about what rec gym we'd been assigned. Then everyone at the table had their attention square on me. I didn't even have to prompt the group. They all had stories of their own from time spent at that gym. One of the coaches tells the group that he'd gotten there a half hour early to set up for practice. When he flips on the lights, the floors were covered with hundreds of dead pigeons. Another coach says that years ago, the whole gym started filling with black smoke. It smelled like fire. He and all of the kids ran outside, but they didn't see any flames. His assistant had run across the street to use the corner store's phone and call the fire department. The building was inspected from top to bottom. They weren't able to find any fire damage. There wasn't even any indication a fire had occurred. But the gym still reeked of pungent smoke the whole season they practiced there. It was like an AA meeting with all of us sitting around the table sharing uncomfortable stories, confiding in each other. I was feeling a little off my rocker before I heard their experiences. I told them about the kid, and one of the coaches tells me that he used to hear the sound of children running around, playing on the stage when he'd be leaving. Although it was nice to hear I wasn't alone in the weirdness, it didn't help the fact that I still had to be there for another 6 weeks. I'd end up making a routine for myself in the way that I'd close down for the nights. All the lights were set up so sporadically throughout that place, I'd have to make crisscross patterns across the gym floor multiple times to strategically flip off each switch in order for me to stay closest to the double doors when the last lights went off. My wife suggested I burn sage while I was there, so during practice I'd keep it in a shell burning on the stage. After doing it a couple of times, the atmosphere started to feel cleaner. I thought that it did the trick until the shell was slid off the stage. The sage had been put out too, which is a difficult thing to do. After that, I was like, whatever, I'm done trying. The rest of the weeks, I made it an art how fast I could get out of there. My last contracted day of service, I was more than happy to hand over the keys. They asked if I wanted the building to host the end of the season team party. I said no, and instead worked out a deal with our local Dave & Buster's to have a party there, without costing me an arm and a leg. So to the manager and staff of Dave & Buster's in Modesto, I'll always be indebted to you for allowing me to host a bunch of hyper kids in your establishment. I don't think I could have done a pizza party with whatever the hell was going on at that gym. I always only planned on doing one season. Our son would age out of youth basketball that year anyway. But this solidified that I wouldn't be volunteering for anything near that gym again. And yes, it still stands. Well, friends, it appears we've reached the end of tonight's episode. Thanks for joining me tonight. Whether it's your first time here or you're a regular, your support means the world over here. So, thanks so much for listening. Don't miss a brand new episode every Friday night. Keep those eyes open long enough to find those deep sleep compilations. Subscribe if you haven't already, and tap the bell so you never miss a thing. A huge shout out to all of my patrons whom I appreciate so very much. Tracy S, Tamara K, Monica L, ZoeWatt, Chelle B, Donald C, Marion T, Rat Girl, Alisha S, Erin G, Nikki H, Mr. Revenant, Naz K, Brendon G, Paul T, Nicholas C, Lissane, Arlene F, and Adrienne. If you want to support The Darkest Hour in other ways, consider joining my Patreon. Check out patreon.com/thedarkesthour or click the link in the description to learn more. I want to thank those who shared their stories, and thanks again to you for listening. Do you have stories like these? I'd love to share them. Send them to me, amandadarkesthour@gmail.com, or on the Darkest Hour subreddit, The Darkest Hour YT. Stay spooky.